Imagine walking into a medieval home during a blizzard. You expect to freeze, but instead, you're hit by a wall of thick, stinging smoke. A family sits on low wooden stools, hunched over a glowing fire pit right in the middle of the room. There is no chimney. They watch the gray smoke rise and swirl against the thatched roof, searching for a tiny hole in the ceiling called a louver. You'd think they'd be gasping for air, but here's the strange part. That smoke was their best friend. While the wind howls outside, the smoke forms a thick, heavy blanket just above their heads. This smoke cloud acts like a thermal layer, trapping radiant heat that would otherwise vanish through the roof. And then it gets better, or weirder. The soot from the fire sticks to the straw thatch, coating it in a black, oily film. What happened next was unexpected. That gross, sticky soot actually waterproofed the roof and killed every wood-eating insect trying to move in. But the heat wasn't enough, so the farmer does something shocking. He leads his massive cow and a few shivering sheep right through the front door. They aren't pets, they are biological heaters. He ties them behind a low wooden rail, and as the animals breathe and shift, their massive body heat raises the room's temperature like a living radiator. To keep the cold from leaking through the walls, the mother and daughter begin clothing the house. They pin heavy wool tapestries and woven straw mats over the cracks in the timber. They aren't decorating, they are stuffing dried moss into the gaps to stop the whistling wind. Even then, the stone walls feel like ice. So, when it's time for bed, the grandfather doesn't lie in an open room. He climbs into a wooden box bed, pulls the shutters tight from the inside, and seals himself in. He's essentially sleeping in a heated cabinet, using nothing but his own breath to stay warm until morning. Imagine it's the middle of a brutal winter night and the fire is dying down. Instead of shivering, a medieval farmer grabs a handful of hay and leads a massive, huffing cow right through his front door. He isn't putting the animal away, he's bringing the heater into the living room. He pushes the heavy beast behind a low wooden rail just a few feet from where his children are sleeping on straw mats. But here's the strange part. This wasn't considered dirty or crowded, it was a survival strategy. A single cow produces as much heat as a modern electric radiator. By packing 3 or 4 animals into the byre end of the house, the family used biological body heat to keep the air from freezing. They lived under one continuous roof, separated from the livestock by nothing but a thin wooden partition. And then it gets weirder. The floor beneath the animals wasn't just dirt. The housewife would spread fresh rushes and herbs over the old straw. As the manure and straw mixed and sat there, it began to slowly ferment and rot. What happened next was unexpected. The chemical reaction of the decomposing floor actually generated its own steady, low heat. It was like having a primitive form of underfloor heating made of compost. By the time morning comes, the family wakes up and sits down at a heavy wooden table. They don't drink cold water. They plunge a red-hot iron poker into a mug of thick ale until it hisses and bubbles. They gulp down the steaming, spiced beer while eating bowls of hot, peppery grain soup. They were fueling their internal furnaces, using high-calorie alcohol and hot pottage to keep their blood pumping before stepping out into the snow. Imagine standing inside a grand medieval manor while a blizzard rages outside. Even with a massive fire roaring, the stone walls feel like blocks of ice that suck the warmth right out of your skin. To fight back, a mother and her daughter begin clothing the room. They drag heavy, thick wool tapestries across the floor and pin them directly onto the freezing stone walls. But they don't stop there. They take handfuls of dried moss and loose sheep's wool, stuffing them into the dark gaps behind the fabric. But here's the strange part. These famous tapestries weren't just for decoration or showing off wealth. They were a sophisticated form of winter armor for the house. By layering the walls with fabric and straw mats, the family created a giant padded box that trapped a pocket of dead air between the room and the stone. Without this, the massive thermal mass of the castle would stay cold for months, making it impossible to ever truly feel warm. And then it gets worse. Even with insulated walls, the drafty floor was a constant enemy. A servant girl kneels down and spreads a fresh, thick layer of dried rushes and sweet-smelling herbs across the cold ground. She piles it inches high until the floor feels like a soft, springy mattress. What happened next was unexpected. As the bottom layers of straw began to pack down and slightly rot, they generated a tiny amount of natural heat, acting like a primitive, decomposing radiator beneath their feet. Before the sun sets, a young boy uses metal tongs to pull glowing river stones out of the fireplace. He wraps them in linen cloths and runs to the beds, tucking the scorching rocks under heavy blankets. These stones acted as portable batteries, holding the fire's heat for hours. Because the family slept in box beds, wooden cabinets with sliding doors, they could seal themselves inside with their hot stones, creating a tiny, humid sauna that kept them safe while the rest of the house dropped to sub-zero temperatures. Imagine it's the dead of winter and your bedroom is so cold that water freezes in the bowl next to your head. Instead of shivering under a pile of blankets, an elderly couple walks toward what looks like a large wooden wardrobe in the corner of the room. They climb inside the cabinet, sit on a straw mattress, and pull the heavy wooden shutters tightly shut from the inside. They aren't hiding, they are going to sleep. But here's the strange part. They aren't using a heater or a fire inside that box. Medieval people realized that heating a whole drafty house was impossible, so they focused on heating the smallest space they could find. Inside this box bed, the couple's own breath and body heat are trapped by the thick wooden walls. Within minutes, the temperature inside the cabinet rises, creating a cozy, private pocket of air while the rest of the house stays at a lethal freezing point. And then it gets worse. Even inside their wooden pod, the air could get damp and stale. To fix this, the husband grabs a smooth river stone that has been sitting in the fireplace all evening. He uses iron tongs to wrap the scorching rock in a thick linen cloth and tucks it at the foot of the bed. What happened next was unexpected. That single stone acted like a thermal battery, radiating heat for hours under the covers. By morning, the couple slides the shutters open and steps back out into the icy room. They immediately head for the table and grab wooden bowls filled with thick, peppery grain pottage. They don't just eat for hunger, they gulp down the steaming mush to jumpstart their internal body heat. They even take a red-hot iron poker from the hearth and plunge it into their mugs of ale, making the liquid hiss and steam before they drink. This was their final layer of defense, heating themselves from the inside out before facing the frozen world outside. Imagine the fire in the center of the room is dying down to glowing red embers. A young servant boy kneels in the dirt, gripping a pair of heavy iron tongs. He reaches into the coals and pulls out a large, smooth river stone that has been heating for hours. He doesn't let it sit. He quickly wraps the scorching rock in a thick linen cloth and runs toward the dark, freezing sleeping quarters. But here's the strange part. This stone wasn't for cooking or building. In a world without electricity, these fire stones were the only portable batteries people had. The boy slides the wrapped stone deep under the heavy wool blankets at the foot of the bed. It acts as a direct heat source, keeping the toes and legs of the sleepers warm in a room where the air is so cold you can see your own breath. And then it gets worse. While the bed stays warm, the floors are like walking on ice. To fix this, a woman begins throwing fresh straw and dried herbs over the floorboards, layering them inches thick. What happened next was unexpected. As the family walked on the straw, it began to pack down and slightly ferment. This chemical reaction in the floor actually created its own low, steady heat, working like a primitive form of underfloor insulation. But even with warm feet and a soft floor, the wind still whistled through the walls. A father and his son take thick, woven straw mats and nail them directly onto the timber frames. They aren't trying to make the house look pretty, they are creating a winter armor to block out the drafts. By the time they finish, the room is a giant, padded box, sealing the family inside a tiny, protected world where the brutal winter can't reach them. Imagine walking across a medieval floor that feels strangely soft and warm beneath your boots. A housewife stands in the center of her cottage, tossing armfuls of fresh straw and dried meadowsweet herbs onto the ground. She isn't cleaning up, she's adding a new layer to a pile that is already several inches thick. But here's the strange part. The floor wasn't just a surface to walk on, it was a living heater. Underneath that fresh straw lay months of older, packed down organic matter. As the bottom layers began to rot and decompose, they triggered a chemical reaction just like a modern compost pile. What happened next was unexpected. The floor actually began to generate its own geothermal heat, warming the room from the mud up. And then it gets worse. While the floor stayed warm, the stone walls were still freezing to the touch. To stop the chill, the woman's daughter takes heavy wool tapestries and pins them tightly against the cold timber frames. She stuffs handfuls of dried moss into the cracks behind the fabric to kill the drafts. This turned the entire room into a giant padded box, preventing the massive stones from sucking the heat out of the family's bodies. When the sun finally sets, the family doesn't just rely on the house to keep them alive. The father takes a red-hot iron poker from the fire and plunges it into a wooden mug of thick ale, making the liquid hiss and steam. They gulp down the hot, spiced beer and bowls of peppery grain soup. They were fueling their internal furnaces, using high-calorie alcohol to keep their blood pumping while they crawled into their wooden box beds to survive the night. Imagine waking up in a room so cold your breath hangs in the air like fog. Instead of shivering, a group of laborers gathers around a heavy wooden trestle table near the hearth. They aren't reaching for water, they are clutching mugs of thick, dark ale. One man takes a glowing, red-hot iron poker directly from the fire and plunges it into his drink. The ale hisses and bubbles violently, sending up a cloud of spiced steam. But here's the strange part. This wasn't just a morning drink, it was survival fuel. To fight a winter that could kill, medieval people had to turn their own bodies into furnaces. They shoveled down wooden bowls filled with pottage, a steaming stew made of grains and heavy pepper. This high-calorie blast jump-started their metabolism, heating them from the inside out before they even stepped into the snow. And then it gets worse. Once they finished their liquid breakfast, they didn't just walk out into the cold. A young boy uses iron tongs to pull a smooth river stone out of the fire's edge. He wraps the scorching rock in a linen cloth and tucks it under his coat. This served as a portable battery, radiating heat against his chest while he worked in the frozen fields. What happened next was unexpected. Even their houses were designed to feed this internal fire. A housewife tosses fresh straw and herbs over a floor that has been rotting for months. As the family walks across it, the decomposing layers underneath generate a steady, low heat. Between the hot beer in their bellies and the fermenting floor beneath their feet, they manage to stay warm in homes that should have been frozen solid.